want to welcome everybody to the American History Book Club, 17 years and counting. Really glad you're here. A special welcome to Governor and Secretary of Education, Dick Riley, to our speaker, David Padilla. And is anyone here for the first time? Oh, good. Welcome aboard. You're going to love it, I hope. As we start the 17th season, it crossed my mind that during these politically and culturally challenged times, it really helps to read American history. It makes a difference. And I'll talk about Leonard Coopersmith, who preceded David, but he sent a podcast yesterday about Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress in New York. And when Governor George Wallace they tried to kill him when he was hit, it was Shirley Chisholm who went to see him. And she knew by doing so, she probably risked not being reelected by her constituents, and it was close. But it's times like Shirley Chisholm that we remember our history, and remember it doesn't have to be all like that all the time, that we're all in this thing together. Someone is bound to ask you, particularly you, why you have joined up with the American History Book Club. What's in it? Well, the answer may be found in an article that Bob Howard, is Bob here? Bob Howard suggested an article from the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, written by Peggy Noonan. And she was quoting David McCullough, the great David McCullough, who is a former American History Book Club speaker. David McCullough suggested that there is a greater gap in America than financial stability. He said the greatest gap in America today is between those who are historically literate and those who are not. It's just a new generation of kids. You ask them, what do you think about Joe McCarthy? And they want to know what team he played on. No idea. McCullough said in this article that reading history reinforces what we believe in, what we stand for, and what we're willing to stand up for. He said today that many of us say and do things that are beneath us, beneath what it means to be an American. He suggested that we watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He said if you're a man and you're teaching your grandson how to tie a tie, watch an old Cary Grant movie. Movies and books are I think, and I agree with McCullough, the way to go. He said he hopes that we will pass on to our children a blazing interest in writers like Henry Adams or Robert Tuchman, Mark Twain, James Agee, and he said particularly Robert Penn Warren, which brings us today to our speaker, David Padilla, head of Christ Episcopal School. And the book he chose to read, as you know, is Robert Penn Warren's masterpiece, All the King's Men. We were just talking, did you all know that David McCullough was an English major, not a history major? And that he took classes, writing classes at Yale from Robert Penn Warren. So David Padilla, Robert Penn Warren, and David McCullough were all English majors. So much for saying you can't get a job with a liberal arts education. David's education included the University of the South, then the University of Virginia, and finally Columbia University in New York. Before accepting his position at Christ School, he was at the Baylor School in Chattanooga for more than 2 decades. First as an English teacher, then as a coach that he lived in, and then eventually, obviously, he became head of the school. Leonard Coopersmith is here in spirit. He is so excited that David is here. But he holds him in a especially high regard. He said, this is Coopersmith, former headmaster at Christ School. He said that David's wisdom, temperament, experience, and scholarship makes him an ideal addition to Christ School, as well as to Greenville, and certainly to the American History Book Club. As we all know, history is the final judge. We make decisions where we have no idea how it's going to come out. Well, the same was true for David. He began his time as head of school at Christ on July 20, 2020, perfectly coincidentally with the pandemic. Every single day at school, David had to make decisions that he had no idea whether they were the best decisions possible or not. History has proven that they were. He led the students and parents through a period that was unprecedented, and history has judged him very wise. So please join me in welcoming David Padilla to the American History Book Club and his book, All the King's Men.
Very kind introduction. I probably rivaled only by the introduction I received this year at the opening convocation at Christ Church Episcopal School from a first grader who at the end of, we had done the Pledge of Allegiance, we had done all the introductions, and he leaned in, little itty bitty thing, leaned in, he said, "And now, welcome our head of school, David Padilla." I was like, I'm taking him on the road. Emmeline, thank you. Very, very kind introduction. Thank you to all of you who are here as part of the American History Book Club. Thanks to Dana Thorpe, who helped coordinate all of this, to my wife Karen, who has been patient through all of these things, all of the attendees. But the real thank you is that by having this opportunity to open the 17th year, it allowed me to return to All the King's Men. I realized when I went, this is the fourth of the copies that I carry, because when they fall apart, I have to get a new one. But it's actually the first time. This is a novel that I've taught probably a dozen times. But in preparation for today, I was reading it with an eye to the intersection of the history and other themes that we'll talk about that allowed me to revisit it fresh. And so thank you for taking the time to be here. As Emmeline noted, I began my career as an English teacher. I still consider an English teacher, and there are days where I would rather be teaching English than doing some of the things that I have to do. However, it is my first professional sort of pathway, and it is something that I've held on to. But as an English teacher, I am not a historian, and I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian. But this novel covers all of those things, and so you have to be conversant in something. Your foundational knowledge has to be able to help you navigate what's happening in this complex novel. Also, as an English teacher, you need to understand my level of comfort with areas of gray is sky high. There's no such thing as black and white. You just have to kind of navigate through that, and I understand that that's a me thing, not an everybody thing. Students often want clarity and answers. They came to the wrong place if that's what they're looking for, because that's really not the way great literature works. Also, I will not even come close to covering everything there is to cover in this novel. I've already heard from a couple of you that this is your favorite novel, and it's my favorite novel too. Just know that with only about 40-ish minutes before we open the floor for some questions and answers, it's going to be breakneck speed, so I apologize on the front end. Next, you need to understand that everything that I am going to say is not David Padilla's opinion. I lean as a reader, as a follower, frankly, of Robert Penn Warren, as you'll hear, was one of sort of the cornerstone critics of the new critical movement, which was in the late 40s, early 50s. So not so new now, but it was a way of reading, and as a product of Sewanee, the University of the South, I was an English major who studied new criticism because that's the way we did things there. So everything I'm going to say is going to be based on what Robert Penn Warren says about the experiences. So do not think that these have to be my positions. And last, as any English teacher will tell you, you always have to make sure that you use the expertise in the classroom as a sort of as a something to bolster you. So I'm going to actually turn the question that I posed, because when you make a proposal for something like this, it's like any conference I present at. They asked me for a title and then a description. That was back in June. So a very complicated contraption, Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men and the Making of an American Identity, sound catchy. So I went with it. And then we're going to see if I can deliver something on that front. So I want to start by laying out the plan that we have today. It's not a super complex plan. I'll give you some background information on Robert Penn Warren, on myself, on Huey Long, for reasons, again, that should be clear. We'll talk about some plot, some themes, some progression over the course of the novel. We will try to directly address Warren's position on what American identity is. And then I think we will have some time for questions and comments. So we go. So we will begin this way. Bowling Green, Kentucky is a small south central Kentucky city. It is the home of the Corvette, if you're curious. It was the capital of the Confederacy in Kentucky. It's only about 20 miles over the Tennessee border. While I was born and raised there by two parents who were in education, my father was a professor at Western Kentucky University, my mother was a high school English teacher. I was dead set on not doing any of those things. Yet here I am. Siri's talking. You don't understand Siri. I don't understand either. So leave her there. But I went to the public school, Bowling Green High School. I did have my mother twice for English because she taught the courses that I needed to take. But here's what I want as I track this really quickly, is that you can connect a lot of things when you're talking about shaping your identity. But as the child of a father who's from Ecuador and a mother who's from New York City, but whose family was from eastern North Carolina, growing up in a small town in southern Kentucky where Nashville was really our bigger city, and where it took about, at that time, a good 8 miles from the interstate to get to something that looks like an actual building. All of those things shaped who I am. But what I thought I would do is zip through my educational background as one way of sort of shaping this question of identity and then relating it to Robert Penn Warren. I, for a whole bunch of reasons that I wasn't clear on at the time, I did apply to Sewanee, the University of the South, because the girl I was dating applied, and that was as robust a logic as I needed at the time. But it was certainly a formative experience for me to go to an Episcopal university on a beautiful mountaintop in southern Kentucky, rather in Tennessee, outside of Chattanooga. I did meet my wife there, and we celebrated our 28th anniversary this year. There are a lot of things that I carried away from Sewanee that shaped how I understand literature and how I understand history, that liberal arts education. From there, I went to my first teaching job. I went right up the road to Exeter, New Hampshire, Phillips Exeter Academy, where I taught as a teaching fellow for a year, followed by a move to Washington, D.C. at St. Albans School, which is on the grounds of the National Cathedral. If you've ever been to D.C., I actually lived on campus there. Some people didn't know that it was a boarding school, but that was my yard, was the National Cathedral. Again, Episcopal education was important there, shaped a lot of what I did. I did know that I was going to go back to graduate school, and I did. I went to the University of Virginia for my master's in English. It was focused on 19th century American literature was my focus, in particular Herman Melville, and in particular his best novel, Billy Budd, not Moby Dick. But it was a great experience to have taught for 4 years before going back to study again. But I knew I was going back into the classroom from there. I continued, as Emily said, to Baylor School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It is a co-ed boarding school. It has students 6 through 12, but boarding 9 through 12. It's on the banks of the Tennessee River. It was gorgeous. We lived on campus for the first 7 years that we were there before buying a house and trying to build some equity. While I was there, I completed a master's in independent school education at Columbia University through the Klingenstein Center. This is not shared with you to point to pedigree. This is shared with you to point to the variety of the experiences that shape each and every one of us. I've spoken with a number of you and in the room, and as I say now at 52 almost, looking back, I can see the organic movement that got me to where I am. But when you're 22 or 25 or 30 or 35 or 40, all ages which I consider young, you don't know looking ahead necessarily what you're going to do. But looking back, I can see how each of these things shaped who I am. So let's shift to Robert Penn Warren for a second. Like me, he is a Kentuckian. He was born in Guthrie, Kentucky in 1905. Make sure I get my... he studied at Vanderbilt. He went there when he was very young. He was, not surprisingly, a very, very good student, a sharp young man. He went there, and in the same way that I at Sewanee was influenced by the folks who were there, by the methodologies that were there, Robert Penn Warren was shaped by his involvement with the fugitive poets, John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, are two of those major figures in American literature. The Southern Agrarian movement, which was defending sort of the agrarian way of life against industrialization. They published the unfortunately named, but still worth reading, I'll Take My Stand in 1930, when Robert Penn Warren was only 25 years old, and he co-edited that piece, already establishing himself sort of on the academic side. Just for good measure, he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he had studied at Berkeley, had studied at Yale, and took his master's at Rhodes. From there, he moved to LSU. This is really going to matter to us because as one of my best friends from college, I had never really spent time in Louisiana at all, and he wasn't from New Orleans. New Orleans was too tame for him. He was from a smaller town, as he said, about 60 miles south, and I think you're running out of country here, a little town called Houma, Louisiana, and he invited me to do something, to fish in what he called a rodeo. And I said, okay. And we went to something he called a camp house, which to me looked like a beach house, but he called it a camp house. And you can't unsee what you see on Grand Isle in the summer at 19 years old. But for Robert Penn Warren, the experiences at LSU were seminal for a couple of things. One was that he did co-found the Southern Review along with Cleanth Brooks and Charles Pipkin. That's important because that literary journal really gave him a hook into the literature of the American South and to shaping that. It also led for him to his work with Cleanth Brooks on two major pieces, Understanding Fiction and Understanding Poetry, which again are sort of cornerstone pieces of the New Critical Movement. The New Critical Movement really quickly hinges on focusing on the word, the language themselves. The biographies of writers matter, but we're not looking for the biographies inside the language of the novel. So when we talk about All the King's Men and the way I approach it, as you'll see in a second, I'm talking about what Robert Penn Warren wrote, not that he's from Kentucky or that he was a Rhodes Scholar. Those things inform how he wrote, but I'm actually interested in what he wrote. That's what's going to guide us as we talk about these items today. Robert Penn Warren is best known, he was known early on, I said, as a critic, as an essayist. But really, his heart was in his poetry. He was an incredibly prolific poet. He was named the first U.S. Poet Laureate in 1986. But that was a relatively easy choice, since he also remains the only person in history to have been awarded the Pulitzer Prize 3 times in 2 different disciplines, twice for poetry and once for fiction. So I guess in 1986 it just made sense. Fun fact, as I said, I grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky. That is actually where his papers reside, at the Robert Penn Warren Center at Western Kentucky University, which is where my father was a professor. And I served on that board early on, had a great opportunity to get to know. So Robert Penn Warren was sort of in the blood, even before I had visited all the King's Men in the way that I have now. So, because he is always going after something else, he also wrote a play. And this is something we don't often get to say, but Robert Penn Warren's play is not very good. He wrote it during one of his sojourns in Italy, and it just wasn't clicking. It actually was produced in the early 40s. And I've looked at pieces of it, but I couldn't get all the way through it. But here's where we move into All the King's Men. There is an unnamed newspaper man in that play, and there's a politician of some sort, and there's some questions, there's some characters that kind of planted the seed. But what it really did was allow for Robert Penn Warren to begin to turn over the story that would become All the King's Men. So Robert Penn Warren maintained throughout his career that Willie Stark, the main character in All the King's Men, is not Huey Long. And I believe him, because the fictionalized version doesn't track. We'll talk about Huey in just a second, and he was certainly a character. But a couple of quotations from Robert Penn Warren about this, I think, are material. The first was this, is that the career of Long and the atmosphere of Louisiana suggested the play that was to become the novel. That was the 1953 introduction to the book that was published in 1946. And the second is this. He said, Willie Stark is not Huey Long. Willie was only himself, whatever that turned out to be. That was in an interview with the Washington Post, 1978. He was remarkably consistent. But the other piece, and it's not captured in a quotation that I could find, but at least it's apocryphal if nothing else, Robert Penn Warren did long maintain that he could never have written All the King's Men if Huey Long had not existed and if he had not lived in Louisiana. There are things you have to understand about those spaces, those people, those characters in order to capture it in literature. Huey Long. Huey Long, Kingfish. This is actually pretty easy because the points are not deniable. He was only 42 when he died. So he was born in rural Louisiana, farming town. He put himself through school. He earned a law degree at Loyola University in New Orleans in 1915. So he's 22 years old. He did practice law and did reasonably well in that, but he was also very ambitious, and he actually won his run for governor. It was his second run, but he won his run for governor in 1928, advocating for populist reforms, including improving education, infrastructure, public spaces. He implemented state controls for utilities and roads. He earned both admiration and accusations of authoritarianism. Judge Irwin in the novel points out to Jack about Willie, the fictionalized version, that you can't make omelets without breaking eggs. And it's something that Willie certainly took to heart. I suspect that Huey Long took it to heart too. Stylistically, he was charismatic, he was controversial. He was perfectly happy to consolidate power by using patronage. He maintained incredibly strong support among the poor and working class. He is, for all intents and purposes, a proto-populist figure in U.S. history. And he changed the way people talked about wealth and inequality and federal grants and programs. All of those things were true. So Huey Long took that and in 1932 was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he continued that same populist advocacy, promoted wealth distribution with a Share Our Wealth program, which was going to aimed at capping personal fortunes and providing guaranteed income for families. These are radical ideas. And through strength of personality, Huey Long was driving this. But it created or provided for Robert Penn Warren a kernel of something he could explore, something he could look for. Now, as it turns out, Huey Long was also assassinated in Baton Rouge on the floor of the U.S. of the Louisiana Capitol by a doctor, Dr. Carl Austin Weiss. That was in 1935. So Robert Penn Warren was just getting his feet sunk in at LSU, and he had the idea that began to turn over that was going to become the novel. The plots, the themes, the progression, things that will sort of lay out where we are. Let's talk about this. On the surface, All the King's Men is the story of Willie Stark. But that's only on the surface. He is a Southern politician who blurs lines between public life and private conscience. He rises from obscurity. He was poor rural farming. He put himself through school, became a lawyer, made some money, ran for governor, accomplished things in ways that were highly questionable. In the novel, we don't have any questions about there's no moral ambiguity when it comes to how you get things done in politics. No offense. I'm just saying, in the novel, again, it's the fictionalized version of this. Willie is ruthless because his ambition is high, and he does, in fact, trade personal moral, a moral center for a public good, but things get really blurry really quickly. There is a wonderful cast of characters in this novel. His mother, who never is named, but obviously a major figure in his life. His father, the scholarly attorney Ellis Burden. No spoiler alerts here. Judge Irwin. The governor, Joel Stanton. Governor Stanton's kids, Ann Stanton and Adam Stanton. Lucy Stark, Tom Stark, Pappy Stark, also unnamed. Sugar Boy, the driver. Sadie Burke, Tiny Duffy, Gummy Larson, Hugh Miller. It's a wonderful cast of characters and caricatures of characters. Robert Penn Warren absolutely had fun creating these individuals in the novel. But I don't know when he started if he knew how they were going to take off. When we're teaching a novel like this, we often talk about what is the novel about? And so, as I said, on the surface, it's about Willie Stark, a politician who uses corrupt means to reach the ends, and we have to decide, do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to buy or bust, in Willie's words, people? Well, it depends on what the goal is. It depends on what's happening there. But here are a few. I just literally scribbled down in looking back over this, a few of the low-level themes that we could focus on. The nature of time, knowledge, fate, values, theology, success, ambition, law, responsibility, reality, idealism, truth, right versus wrong, good versus bad, luck, change, and the definition of greatness. All of those are in play in this novel. The novel does actually hinge, though, on Jack Burden, our narrator. And the narrative point of view is, in fact, the thing that really controls the way the pacing of the novel goes, and, as I would argue, forces Robert Penn Warren at about a midpoint in the novel to make some decisions about whether this is Willie's story or Jack's story. Jack narrates the events after they happen, and since we're at the American History Book Club, we need to understand that that is actually a luxury. The novel, from the beginning, opens up establishing that everything is retrospective. And it's important when I'm talking with groups about this to say that if we know the now is 1939, but the action begins in 1936, and then it spreads all the way back to pre-Civil War, 1939 is still the now of the novel, which means everything that Jack Burton is telling us has been processed. He has the advantage of having processed everything that happened. He knows how the story ends. We don't, but he does. So that's the first thing. The second is this. That is simply a narrative technique. The number of times that I've had to say to students when they talk about, well, it's just, this is kind of just stream of consciousness. I have to clarify to them, you need to understand, stream of consciousness is a super complex way of delivering a narrative. William Faulkner, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, they didn't just sit down, well, Faulkner probably poured himself a drink, but they didn't just sit down and start writing. They're creating something that mirrors the way the mind works, which I think we can all agree is not linear. So, keep that in mind. Jack Burton knows how the story is going to end, and Robert Penn Warren knows how to create the experience for Jack so that we get to see this happen. And as promised, we have to move into a conversation about American identity, because back in June, that's what I chose as the title. So here we are. I did what certainly any student would do these days, but I'm always curious because for anybody who experiments with AI work, it's really fascinating. There have been a string of articles in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times about even down to counseling, how AI, how chatbots are providing counseling for not just young people. I mean, I read a fascinating article by an established counselor who said, honestly, the chatbot counseling advice was pretty on point. So I went to ChatGPT just to see what it would say. I was like, how do you define American identity? And not surprisingly, it's actually a pretty good definition. It's not as full, right? The chatbot's never going to capture what Robert Penn Warren can do. But it's not a bad way of framing an understanding about American identity. But here are the things that I want to make sure you understand on the front end. For Robert Penn Warren, what we call American identity is shaped by both individual and shared pasts. That's important. So what you do and what happens to you matters, but what others do and what happens to them also matters. Second, those are co-equal. It drives my wife crazy when I use the word co-equal. She's like, just say equal. It's not equal. It's different. You cannot discriminate between the two. They are equal, which is tough because we like to think as humans that our experiences are the defining piece. Robert Penn Warren does not seem to hold that position. Third, the past is not fixed. If I could talk about, there's an entire scene in this novel that is one of my favorites, where the past, we actually watch it change. And the reason it changes is because Jack will talk about truth and fact and understanding that those things are different. But what we believe at any given point to be the truth about something based on fact can in fact be changed. And last is that Robert Penn Warren believes that we have the power to manage those pasts. So that is where we are to get to this. I will try to be fair in skipping over things quickly, but I'll give you bits and pieces. I've included page numbers for this edition, which is sort of the authoritative version of the novel, so you can actually see how methodical Robert Penn Warren was in laying out the argument, though he did reach a point where he had to make some decisions. Famously, 14 pages into the novel, we get the first sort of deep dive into Jack Burden's mind. He says, "The end of man is knowledge, but there's one thing he can't know. He can't know whether knowledge will save him or kill him. He'll be killed, all right, but he can't know whether he's killed because of the knowledge which he has got or because of the knowledge which he hasn't got, and which, if he had it, would save him." Even 16-year-olds, when we're reading this in a high school classroom, will pause long enough to say, whoa, there's a lot going on there. Classic Robert Penn Warren, sneaking in philosophy while you think you're reading a novel about a politician who, by the time we meet him, is womanizing and drinking too much and leaning on people for all sorts of nefarious reasons, and he's a big talker and a good speech maker, all the things. A 135 pages later, we get a different kind of book. By this point, what we've seen is how Willie Stark became Willie Stark. When Jack met him, he did not drink, he did not curse, he was married to his wife Lucy. He did not participate in anything questionable. They had a young son. That was back in 1922. By the time we open the story, Willie has stopped being what Jack calls Cousin Willie from the country and has become the boss, capital B. Inside this narrative, he'll weave things in like this. Maybe the things you want are like cards. He goes on to say, you don't want them for themselves, really, but you think you do. You don't want a card because you want the card, but because in a perfectly arbitrary system of rules and values, and in a special combination of which you already hold a part, the card has meaning. But suppose you're sitting in a game, but suppose you aren't sitting in a game. Then, even if you do know the rules, a card doesn't mean a thing. They all look alike. My classic example here is I want one thing if I'm playing spades and another thing if I want hearts. They're just not the same game. The cards are the same, but they're not. So, the last of these, before we get into the history part of the identity, is one of my favorite lines. We've kind of gotten to know Jack a little bit by this point. We're a couple hundred pages into the novel. We feel like we have a good handle on Willie Stark. We see his circle. We understand what's happening. Jack, who's from a place called Burden's Landing, which is on the Gulf Coast, fictionalized Gulf Coast, where his family name has established this place, gets in the car to drive back to the city. Also important things. Jack Burden does not have a house. He lives in hotel rooms. You get a lot of mileage about what that means for Jack. In the city, he does not have anything that locks him down. But Jack gets in the car, and this is really where we begin to see the intersection of history and identity beginning to merge. He says there's nothing more alone than being in a car at night in the rain. They say you are not you except in terms of relation to other people. If there weren't any other people, there wouldn't be any you. Because what you do, which is what you are, only has meaning in relation to other people. I often ask students, who is the real you? Is it the you on Friday night after a football game? Or is it the you at lunch on Sunday after church? And the only reason I would draw a distinction is because you are the same person. But I'm guessing that you were doing some things or making some choices on Friday night that as you sit with your grandparents after church on Sunday would be less palatable. Again, Robert Penn Warren has this uncanny knack for being able to tie these things together. He launches next into what he calls the excursions into the past. And he clarifies that the student of history does not care what he digs up out of the pile. Jack can say this on page 235. But as we move forward, he takes us on two different excursions into the past, which really call into question how this identity history piece intersect. So we're going to focus first on the story of Cass Mastern, which was Jack's first excursion into the past. It is one that he's going to tell us is not successful. But as you can see, the language is already beginning to shift here, where this story of Cass Mastern has nothing to do with Jack Burton, except it kind of does, because these stories begin to merge. The second excursion into the past, which we'll also talk about, the case of the upright judge, is perfectly successful. The first one failed because as he studied, what he learned he couldn't deal with. So Cass Mastern is Robert Penn Warren, or rather William Faulkner's, famously, and we couldn't find a quote attributable to this, but again, anecdotally, Faulkner, when he read a draft of the novel, said, well, chapter 4, which is the Cass Mastern chapter, you can keep that, that's a story. The rest, let it go. Cass Mastern chapter, and again, I could do an entire presentation simply on Cass Mastern because it's so critical. But for our purposes, Jack is studying for a PhD in history, and he is distantly related to Cass Mastern, and he gets Cass Mastern's journals. Cass Mastern died from an injury during the Civil War. And Cass is somebody who tried to live a way that was meaningful and right and positive, but ended up in an illicit affair with his best friend's wife, and realized in doing so that he had lost who he was, or rather, the way it's set up in the novel, he had never really known who he was. He reaches a point where, upon the first violation with Annabelle Trice, he says, I was somehow possessed by incredulity even as to my identity. He goes on to say, there was no remorse or horror at the turpitude of the act, but only the incredulity which I have referred to. And then he says, one feels incredulity at the first breaking of a habit, and horror at the violation of a principle. Therefore, what virtue and honor I had known in the past had been an accident of habit and not the fruit of will. Or can virtue be the fruit of human will? The thought is pride. These are heavy philosophical positions to take up. But as we're watching Jack or listening to Jack tell us how this happened, because he ends up abandoning the story of Cass Mastern. And he abandons it because he comes to realize one of the great controlling metaphors of the novel is the spider web. And he says, Cass lived for a few years in a time learned that the world is all of one piece. He learned that the world is like an enormous spider web, and if you touch it, however lightly at any point, the vibration ripples to the remotest perimeter, and the drowsy spider feels the tingle and is drowsy no more, but springs out to fling the gossamer coils about you who have touched the web, and then inject the black, numbing poison under your hide. Cass Mastern, in that act of perfidy, as he calls it, the violation with his best friend's wife, his best friend commits suicide, but not without leaving a sign to his wife that he knew she was being unfaithful. The wife can't handle this. They are slaveholders. She sells the slave who discovered the wedding band that the husband had left under the pillow of their marital bed. And Cass comes to understand that even if it wasn't his intention, his actions have consequences. So we deal with the story of Cass Mastern, that's laying the groundwork, chapter 4. We move into the case of the upright judge, which is the 5th chapter. Before we get there, Jack reflects on this, and I draw this to your attention, this is the opening of the 5th chapter, so we're now almost 300 pages into a 600-page novel. 661 pages in this edition. But here's what I think stands out most here, because Jack is tipping his hand that he's understanding things differently. He had failed in finding the truth of the cast Mastern story. He had succeeded in finding the truth about Judge Montague Irwin. But what he had also come to realize is this: what mars his success is that it meant something. The study of history, if it's abstraction, is easy to keep distant. The more you study, to your point, Emmeline, at the beginning from David McCullough's work, the more you begin to understand that what happened 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or perhaps 500 years ago, does in fact have an effect on who we are now and how we're doing what we're doing. This is, it turns out that Judge Irwin, in order to save himself, had accepted a bribe. Again, these aren't really spoiler alerts. These will all lay out for you if you revisit the novel. And the answer to this question that Jack asks, is any relationship a relationship in time and only in time, is a resounding no. He shares that news with his friend Adam Stanton. He had noted that as a student of history, we always learn is that the human being is a very complicated contraption, and that they're not, this is where it gets messy in a good way, that they are not good or bad, but are good and bad, and the good comes out of the bad out of the good, and the devil take the hindmost. Jack is good with the words, but we get to hear it in a processed manner. He does fall in love. He is connected with Anne Stanton, his beloved. There's an entire segment on how when you love somebody, it is this creative act that is interesting because you take this ball of clay and you are both reshaped by it while you are reshaping the other person. There's a lot of beautiful philosophy, but again, identity becomes a little more malleable, a little less fixed. He goes on to focus on things like this, which, as he says to us, we're now 467 pages into the novel. I had not understood then what I think I've come to now to understand, that we can keep the past only by having the future, for they are forever tied together. That ChatGPT definition really did focus on the past and the effect on the present, the individual and collective experiences. But by the time we reach this point in the novel, where Jack is making those kinds of claims, Robert Penn Warren has unshackled his position. This is not unusual. Again, we could talk about any number one of these. When I read Antigone for the first time in high school, I was like, why isn't this play called Creon? Because it's really about the king and how he falls apart, not really what Antigone does. Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio, in Othello, Iago, and in King Lear, the fool. In the first and the last, Shakespeare had to kill those characters off because they were threatening to take over the play. You can't have Mercutio stay there, he's too good. And you can't have the fool in Lear stay there because he's too honest. And with Othello, the more intriguing character is Iago. Othello's kind of a dolt. But Iago lapses to silence. That's how Shakespeare managed this. By the way, the lines between Shakespeare and Robert Penn Warren are very tight. In Huck Finn, I read Tom Sawyer before I read Huck Finn. Tom Sawyer is a middling novel at best. Huck Finn is the real deal. And even more contemporaneously, Blood Meridian, if you've not read it, Just make sure you like time your meals. There's some violent stuff in Cormac McCarthy. But I've taught that novel also, and I couldn't tell if I was supposed to be reading for the kid, the primary character initially, or the judge, the character who really takes over. Cormac McCarthy was very adept at this. My point is this: I think that Robert Penn Warren had sort of unshackled. This is no longer the story of Willie Stark. This is clearly the story of Jack Burton. And as the story of Jack Burton, it becomes for us a kind of story where we have to rethink sort of reality and how we are approaching what we're doing. Because we're 580 pages into the novel, and what we had thought back in the beginning is that we were reading a political sort of pathway, but we're not. We're really reading about how people, in particular Americans, become Americans. So we get things like this, and we begin to focus on where Robert Penn Warren does come down most strongly. Direction is all, he says. And only as we realize this do we live, for our own identity is dependent upon this principle. There is more here, the theory of historical costs versus the theory of the moral neutrality of history. I would love to talk more about that. But by the end of the novel, Jack's mother leaves. A whole bunch of things have happened, by the way. It is a wonderful narrative, but by that midpoint after we get past Cass Mastern, the plot of the novel isn't really our primary concern. It just happens. Really what we get focused on is how Jack is undoing and redoing his identity and what that means for us. But Jack, by the end, tells us, "This has been the story of Willie Stark, but it is my story too." And we begin to get to one of the spots, this the closing line of the novel, which along with probably, it's a handful of novels, maybe Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, maybe The Great Gatsby, where authors kind of held this sentence that they knew they wanted to use, and then they lay it on you, and then hit the period. They had typewriters. All of them had typewriters. None of them had word processors. So they held the sentence. But this is the closing sentence of the novel for Robert Penn Warren. So in teacher fashion, what I do is they say, so what does Robert Penn Warren ultimately say about American identity? And I could turn it to you. But I want to make sure that I note that since it's what I said I was going to offer, I think this is where we land, not the ChatGPT version. I think for Robert Penn Warren, in the course of this novel, the way he lays it out, and he tricks you because you enjoy the novel, because it's well written, and even if it's long, it's good. In the world of the novel, the American identity is ultimately an exercise in acknowledging the complexity of our past, studying both fact and truth in an attempt to understand that complexity, applying what we glean from that acknowledgement and study to our present so that we can better evaluate who we are presently through that lens. But what Robert Penn Warren adds is this. The step beyond that is that your past, which is in fact malleable, can be shaped, and you can understand it differently, you take what you learn and you have to choose how to shape your future. I think in the end, the novel, the reason it's timeless is because that doesn't stop. It's really not about Willie's politics. It's really not about how things get done. It's not about good roads or social programs. It's not about whether bribery is good or bad. Again, I'm not suggesting bribery is good. I'm simply saying those are all secondary pieces to the concerns that we get in the novel. And instead, I think the thing that is uniquely American about this is that what we are watching in this novel is the establishment and understanding, because in the end, our history as a country is very short. And it's actually digestible. We're still watching ourselves learn what we can learn from what's happened. I think it's harder. We took a trip this summer to Greece. I think it's a whole lot harder as I'm wandering through the streets of Ephesus, because I've lost that link. I've lost that connection. Here, we have it. So with that, don't know if we've settled American identity, except I cannot commend the novel enough. I do tell people, master of the bold statement, if there is a better American novel, then you have some convincing to do with me, because it offers us all that we need. And again, I want to thank you all for indulging me and for giving me another reason to revisit this. So I'm happy to, I know we're on time, we're running tight on time, but I'm happy to answer questions. Anything burning or not burning? I had an entire another segment on the richness. I've studied a lot of, read a lot of criticism about this, and just this summer, in Political Science Reviewer, there was another piece, "The Devil in Humpty Dumpty," a Gerardian reading of All the King's Men. I mean, it's still incredibly present. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
You've had 2 or 3 careers: classroom teacher, graduate student.
I was not allowed to make it a career. I was paying for it myself, so.
Manager of a private school. How has your perspective changed?
Reading, so I think, first of all, maturity does, right? As we age, we understand. Before I was a parent, I read it one way. You know, as a sibling, I read it one way. As the son of aging parents now, right? My father celebrated his 90th birthday this year. My humility has grown by leaps and bounds as I've gotten older. And thus, when I look at this, I would read, there's a point in the novel where Lucy Stark, she's known that her husband's a philanderer. She's known that he uses underhanded tactics to get things done. But she tells Jack after Willie has been shot, not a spoiler alert, right? Huey Long was shot, Willie is shot. Huey Long was shot by a doctor, Willie is shot by a doctor. She says, Willie was a great man. I have to believe that. And I think for me, the reading and the shift in perspective has really been greater sympathy for others, greater empathy, and a better understanding. The longer I live, the more mistakes I get to make, is really what it comes down to. And so understanding, and you try to minimize the mistakes, but you also understand the effect more broadly. So for me, it is the maturing and perspective. It's really not where, I mean, if I walked into a class of 16-year-olds right now and taught this novel, they're still going to be 16. And we tell them all sorts of things. We try to tell them. Robert Penn Warren's better at it than I am, but I want them to be exposed to it and to have the opportunity to grasp it. Yes? I'm sorry, I don't know. Yep. Yes.
So, is there any difference?
You know, I think the way Faulkner presents, I mean, part of it is stylistic, right? I mean, much more conventional in Robert Penn Warren than you do in Faulkner, and so Faulkner gets at things. I've had the good, I would cheat. When I was in the classroom full time, I would cheat by forcing the students to read books that I wanted to read. So I think I've taught 8 Faulkner novels. Whereas Faulkner was one of his nicknames, Count No Count, right? I mean, he sold his soul to Hollywood. He had a pretty significant drinking issue. He used his literature to kind of explore, and he created a world, right? Jakob Taffa. He created a world to explore and put things in motion. Robert Penn Warren, by all accounts, seems to have been a pretty decent man. Like, no major vices that we know of. Faithful. Would get up and swim when he was 82 years old to, get his morning workout. I think that if Faulkner and Robert Penn Warren could have had a real good conversation about it, it would have been interesting. I think Faulkner probably would have been, I'm not sure that I would have, I think I would have enjoyed spending time with Faulkner, but only so much. Whereas I think with Robert Penn Warren, I actually could kind of enjoy myself. I don't think their perspectives, I think that Robert Penn Warren would say that when he points out that the past is not fixed, in that your understanding can adapt, Faulkner is much more concerned with the effect of the understanding that went forward, and Robert Penn Warren is more interested in what happens when you realize that the past you thought was your past has shifted under you. There's a whole lot in the novel about that. I'll stop there. Courtney, yeah? No, I think it's different, and which is not what you were suggesting. You're not suggesting that we take our value systems today and apply them retroactively to something, but rather that it changes how we understand that. I think part of what Robert Penn Warren does in this novel is actually make the claim that what you think you knew is not what was really there. The scene, one of the more famous scenes is there's a ballista, he's working with Judge Irwin, and when Jack was a young boy, they would make these models of catapults and whatnot. And Judge Irwin, they're at dinner one night as adults, and he pulls it out, and they shoot this ballista, little pea shooters, little wad of paper, whatever it is, just to kind of see what it is. And Jack was like, it's incredible to see the zing had not gone out of that after all these years. But he sticks around after dinner, and he looks at it a little more closely, and he realizes that was a misstatement of fact, he says. The zing hadn't had a chance to go out of it because the judge had continued to maintain that toy without Jack being there. And for Jack, what he thought was true ceased to be true. And what the novel explores is then, okay, so what do you do then? Like, how do you process that? It's a fascinating psychology to explore, and it also just happens to be, again, it was a gift to me to be able to reread this after having been away from it for about 5 years, what with COVID and running schools and whatnot. Yes? I don't even hesitate on this. I'm incredibly hopeful. I'm an optimist in general. And I think that maybe it goes back to what I was saying before. Again, you spend time in Greece where your tour guide, without even blinking, is like, well, 2,000 years ago. I was like, oh, okay. And the number of times that things happen. I mean, I'm hopeful. I do think we've got to keep a close eye. I mean, schools like Christ Church and Greenville High, I mean, it's not just us. I mean, foundational knowledge and getting a grasp of the history of this country in order to avoid the mistakes, but also to allow the mistakes to inform what we do going forward, I think is critical. I wouldn't be in education. This is the most delayed gratification profession at all. You don't. It's the reason I mow my own lawn. It's the only thing where I can be like, I did something today. I did this. This lawn has been mowed. As opposed to waiting. I get an email from a student that I taught in 2007 the other day, who's a dentist in Memphis, and he sent me a piece of writing that he had done, just saying, hey, I remember this statement you made. Actually, the statement that I made to him was, this is back in 2007. It's like, Henry, you are either the smartest dumb kid I know or the dumbest smart kid I know. He said, I don't know if you remember saying that. And I said, absolutely I remember saying it. That's the truth. Look at you. He appreciated it now in a way he couldn't then. But I think that, I don't know, I think the danger is trying to pin a single, this is why the Huey Long, Willie Stark thing doesn't, I think Robert Penn Warren was sincere. He couldn't have written the novel if Huey Long hadn't existed. But Willie Stark is not Huey Long, because we get to go in there and kind of see the mechanics, right? We pull back the curtain and look at how it is made. And again, it makes it much more, it makes me a much more, I try to be much more empathic about how we got to where we are and what that is going to mean for our future. Thank you all again. You've been incredibly indulgent. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Let me have your attention just a second. If direction is everything, David, you have put us in the right direction for all the future speakers coming. You've told us things that we needed to hear. Thank you.